Phil says, Michelle, you know right from wrong at a very early age. Most kids are pretty switched on by the age of 10. It's one thing being pretty switched on, Philip, but are you aware criminally of what is illegal, what is a crime, what is not? This is kind of what I'm pondering tonight. Richard says reducing it to 10 would massively help cure the problem of antisocial behaviour and would help the police too. It is 10 in England, Wales. Sorry?
And it hasn't.
No, that's Emma Burnell, by the way, Philip. Richard, sorry. She's chipping in there saying it hasn't helped matters. Many of you are saying 12, so that is what I'm pondering right now. Just heard, by the way, that story in the States of a 6-year-old. I mean, I'm not comparing us to the States, but goodness me, what kind of world do we live in? So the minimum age of criminal responsibility, MACA it's sometimes called, it is 10 in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, but it's out for public consultation at the moment in Northern Ireland about potentially raising it. The age in Scotland is 12. There's always conversations, Emma Burnell, about where is the right level. I always sit there and I think of James Bulger. I will never forget it until the day I die.
No, you can't not, can you? It's, of course, the first case that springs to mind, particularly of anyone of our generation. We remember that so clearly and so viscerally, I think. Look, it's really hard. I would not set the criminal age of responsibility at 10 because I think there is a difference between knowing the basic right and wrong that a 10-year-old understands and understanding consequences. And we have a lot of discussions about the kinds of decisions that we should and should not be allowing teenagers to make, usually around their own bodies. So should you be drinking? Should you be smoking? Should you be having sex? Should you be allowed to make life-changing alterations to your body under the age of 16, under the age of 18? We have those discussions because we know that age 10, somebody's understanding of the future and the consequences are not fully formed. And so we do, as a society, have to understand what we do with people who behave abhorrently but are not yet fully formed, grown-up human beings able to understand the consequences of that behaviour. We, of course, have to take children who, I mean, the reason that we remember the Jamie Folger crime is because it was so extreme and so outside of the norm that it's not statistically significant, as it were, in terms of the levels of criminality. But those children have to be
as criminals.
They committed a criminal act.
But do you
we have to take those children out of society. How that then happens, whether they should have gone through a grown-up trial is different from should they be removed from society, which they absolutely had to be.
They're not children anymore. They were 10, quite right to say. Those two people that snatched, tortured and ultimately essentially murdered a 2-year-old, do you think that they were criminals?
I think they were not... They shouldn't have been tried as criminals. I think they should probably have been in Broadmoor or whatever the child equivalent of Broadmoor is for the rest of their lives, because they were clearly in such a state of mental negligence that they were unable to... I mean, they were immoral. They were amoral, even, without morals.
Disgusting.
Absolutely disgusting.
You can't compare them to a 30-year-old who knows full well the consequences of their actions and keeps on behaving. I don't think you can compare a 10-year-old and a 30-year-old because they just aren't the same person. My fear around raising the age is that what we will do is end up sort of brushing off behaviour that happens before 12 as, oh, that's just childish, this, that, and the other, that's just hijinks, that doesn't matter. And I think it's very interesting that this has happened in Scotland, seeing as there's a major push in Scotland to also reduce the voting age down to 16. And you kind of sat there going, so, you know, where does the responsibility happen? The younger they are, they're more responsible to make big life-changing decisions and also criminal behaviour. What happens there? I think... putting sort of a firm label on something around age 10 or 12, this is a criminal, this isn't necessarily the most helpful thing. But I do think that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have very firm intervention and the potential to take children out of society.
Absolutely.
There will always be the occasional examples of children who can never be part of society, as I think is the case of James Bulger. But, thank God, that isn't a regular occurrence.
Absolutely.
It's actually quite unusual. There should be... measures in place for people like that to be removed, but that doesn't mean that, you know, children who, you know, get into fights and accidentally, you know, maim somebody or something like that because they're being children, that doesn't mean that they're the same as a psychopath. You know, it doesn't mean that they're the same as a 30-year-old who has known for most of their life that this is wrong and continues to behave in a violent way. I think there needs to be some understanding that, yes, they understand right and wrong, but as Emma says, they don't have a consequence of any idea of consequences. They don't have a concept of time in the same way that an adult does either. You know, you can say, you're going to go to prison for the rest of your life. You've barely been alive for 5 minutes. You don't know what that means. It's entirely different.
See, I think too many people are too soft. I do, on kids. I've got...
I agree with that. I think a lot of people are soft, but I don't think that, you know, saying that somebody is a criminal at 12 rather than 10 makes the blindest bit of difference there. What we still need is intervention.
It matters to the outcome.
Well, does it matter to the outcome if you're saying to a child...
If you're going to lock them up permanently anyway...
Yeah.
Well, we don't lock anyone up permanently.
Well, I mean, that's a whole different matter. But if what we're talking about is if you commit that kind of atrocious crime that is once in a generation, you are removed permanently from society, and we all agree on that on this panel, I think. But that's not the same.
Those two people weren't removed permanently
but that's what we're saying. They should have been. But there's a difference between that removal being psychiatric and that removal being criminal. And that if you make a blanket law for all 12-year-olds based on that case that was once in a generation, that's a different, that has different consequences and different outcomes.
Also, they were released as adults. So again, that's a different conversation about whether or not you can be, as it were, cured of what it was that afflicted them, which I think most people would say, no, you can't be. So that's a different conversation, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, this whole James Bulger thing, it is. I think it's an age thing because those two people, I don't even like... To me, they're animals, those two people that did that to that little boy. They were released. They were given a whole anonymity, courtesy of the taxpayer. One of them proved himself to be a monumental wrong-un in and out of the justice system again. And I just think so many people look upon it and say, oh, but they're children, they're children, they're children. And it just doesn't wash with me. Sue, as messaging says, Michelle, I am a worker in child protection and I can say that children are only able to understand their responsibility regarding criminal actions dependent on their parenting. Many children are never taught right from wrong. Sue, I bow to you as the professional, but I've got to be honest, it don't really wash with me. Because surely, you know, you can be the worst parented child in the land. You must know if you attack somebody, if you steal, if you whatever. Surely you must know that that's wrong. Am I deluded? I don't know. I mean, I bow to the professionals, of course. Amy says 10 is probably a reasonable age to be held criminally responsible, but the court should and probably do consider their age very carefully when thinking about mitigating circumstances and any sentencing. The two Bulger killers, by the way, they actually took a case to the European Court of Human Rights, if that's the right label for it, and they got a payout because actually it was ruled that they didn't get a fair trial because they went through the adult court system. And
I mean, again, that would be a change in... If they hadn't gone through the criminal system, they wouldn't have been able to bring that case.
Yeah, but I think... honestly, I've got to be careful because I get so emotional about this.
This is the problem, though. We have to take out, when making law, you can't make law based on the Bulger case, much as we wish to emote about it.
It's a thing, isn't it?
I feel every bit as sick as you do, Michelle.
Support for capital punishment goes through the roof. Yes. The whole idea is that, you know, we're supposed to make laws not based on, you know, in the heat of the moment because bad laws are made, which is the same, actually, when it comes to things like striking and things like that. If you make the laws whilst the strikes are going on, you're likely to make the wrong kind of laws because it's a different set of circumstances to when you're looking at it in the cold, hard light of day. Yeah,
and I've got to say, I do concede that particular case makes me enormously emotional, but also now than ever, because I've got a little boy the same age of James Bulger. So it's just such an awful case. Bernard says 7-year-olds these days can talk to you like an adult. A 7-year-old today is equivalent to a 12-year-old 50 years ago. I'm not sure that's a scientific.
We should not be speaking to 7-year-olds like adults, and they should not be having access to that kind of adult conversation.
I'm of the complete opposite. I think people extend their childhoods and adolescence far into their 20s now. I don't think people do grow up that far. There's
ways and ways, aren't there? I think there's a real problem with children having access to far too much adult content, but there's also an infantilisation of all of us. I mean, you know, well into our 20s, 30s, 40s, even in my case.
Well, indeed.
Where we don't live the more grown-up life that we once expected to.
Yeah, and just so you're aware, in France, for example, is 13, Italy 14, Spain 14, Australia 10, Northern Ireland, I said, of course, is 10, but they are putting it out to consultation as we speak. Very emotive subject, isn't it? I have to be honest. Anyway, keep your thoughts coming in.